So a warm welcome as president of the German Historical Museum. It is a great pleasure for me to greet you here in our armory, cinema, Zeughaus, Kino. It's a bit tricky to translate that. We had actually hoped that Federal Chancellor Angela Merkel would have been able to extend this greeting. Unfortunately, she had to decline on scheduling ground, not without emphasizing, however, how important she considers this, our conference. Thus, I am the one extending my welcome to you for a kind of birthday celebration meant to honor a great historian, teacher, mentor, and friend, and to do so in the city where he has been born 100 years ago, following the full day devoted on yesterday's program to Berlin as a Mossestadt. I hardly need to spell out the very close ties that existed between the Mosse family and this city. As one of the highly distinguished Berlin families, the Mosses have left us with an impressive legacy. That this fact has become increasingly visible in Berlin is largely due to the efforts of individuals present here today. Personally, I consider it very important to see George Mosse's legacy in particular accorded greater attention in the German Historical Museum. When we were asked, approached, whether we were interested in housing this conference, we thus saw it not only as a great honor, but also a great opportunity. For although the conference themes are in principle important for a museum of German history, a concern with them is nevertheless remarkably also something new for us. This is tied to the fact that in the areas he chose to focus on and the question he posed, George Mosse was far ahead of his times in manifold ways, above all in the context of German historiography and German society. Since I know that following these introductory remarks, Stephen Eschheim will discuss George Mosse's work in far more detail, I'd like now to just briefly sketch what that work has to do with our institution and why it is so important for us that you are all here today. In its clear differences from what would appear later on, Mosse's early writing is of considerable interest both biographically and in terms of the sociology of scholarship. For here, in his early writings, it seems to me one thing we find reflected is a need to demonstrate through some very solid classical scholarship a capacity to do research on something that, so to speak, has personally nothing to do with the author. Then, with his professorship at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, where he would later write, he was finally at home. He found his personal themes that now has, as before, appear to be of extraordinary and, in part, increasing relevance. In Germany, George Mosse's works with telling titles such as Toward the Final Solution, A History of European Racism, The Crisis of German Ideology, Intellectual Origins of the Third Reich, and The Nationalization of the Masses, Political Symbolism and Mass Movements in Germany from the Napoleonic Wars through the Third Reich, would only see print, say, 12, 15, or 18 years after their American publication. And even then, they would encounter a reading public that, if it was especially progressive, had only just begun to grapple with questions of contemporary social and economic history. But appreciating the radical approach to cultural history, evident in Mosse's writing, lay well in the future. The connections Mosse uncovered between racism, imperialism, and colonialism, and his probing look at problems of sexuality, ageism, and ableism, and their own implications regarding racism, have established new standards. Hence, towards the final solution, he located the roots of racism in the shadow of an Enlightenment still generally associated in 1978 with its positive contents: freedom, individual autonomy, light. Likewise, in his various works, Mosse identified racism as a socially and culturally entrenched ideology alongside conservatism, liberalism, and socialism. This comprehensive conceptual system, he emphasized, stood in spatial and temporal interchange with imperialism. But crucially, Mosse added that system showed what he called its true face and reached its goals in the place where it had emerged in Europe. In making these arguments, Mosse wrote against the tendency of play of anti-Semitism and colonialism against each other. All this work of George Mosse remains deeply illuminating and of great topicality, not least of all for a historical museum such as ours. Nevertheless, Mosse's themes have hardly been integrated into a German museum context. If I underscore this, then I do so not as a criticism of my own forerunners at the Deutsches Historisches Museum. It seems to me historically interesting that the immense space for reflection about, for instance, race that Mosse opened up in his work is hardly evident in the circa 8,000 square meters of our permanent exhibition. This mirrors, I would argue, a social approach to the phenomenon in question that has been maintained until today. On the one hand, we find a strong general desire not, so to speak, to be racist, and careful inquiries into whether this or that statement could be understood or interpreted in that way. But on the other hand, there is an unmistakable tendency to evade a deeper confrontation with the history of racism and anti-Semitism in Europe, with the complexity of its forms and with its deep embedding in European cultural history. There is thus a strong reluctance to understand this ideology of hatred as what Mosse conceivingly defined as an essential element of European experience. But engaging oneself with George Mosse's work can also point to other lacunae in our museum's permanent exhibition. An extensive depiction of the German Jewish culture Mosse described in German Jews Beyond Judaism is thus missing, as is a suitable presentation of the history of exile that Mosse himself embodied in manifold ways. All of this is presently being considered by my team and myself in preparing the groundwork for a newly conceived permanent exhibition, a project for which we will often return to George Mosse's work. We thus are especially grateful to welcome a conference that brings together students of George Mosse, a group comprising some of the most distinguished historians of modern European history. I myself was able to study with George Mosse in Cambridge, England, where I became acquainted with him as a remarkable teacher who succeeded to an extraordinary degree in developing an animated and multifaceted intellectual community around him. Mosse knew not only how to pose questions, but also how to move others to do so. In that spirit, it is both an honor and great pleasure to be able to reflect on important questions with you in remembrance of a great historian here in the German Historical Museum over the coming days. Before we begin, I would like to express special thanks to members of the organizational committee who have made our conference possible, namely to Steve Aschheim, Ofer Ashkenazi, to Sky Dani, Tina Grossman, Marie-Louise Roberts, Anson Rabinbach, Moshe Shluchowski, David Sorkin, and John Todorich. Warm thanks as well to Jenny Jakubik, so I can't pronounce the name now in English of our German members of staff, Jenny Jakubik, for her organizational work, as well as two members of our communication departments, Barbara Wolf and Nike Thorn, who were very active to make this happen. And of course, I would like to extend the thanks to our co-sponsors in Madison, Jerusalem, and in Berlin. And I'm also looking forward that one part of this conference will happen at the Jewish Museum in Berlin, so we also have this connection here. So I'm closing now my introductory remarks, and Stephen Asham and I discussed that I will not speak for half an hour, so he will have more time and will have more time to discuss than his paper. But before that, let me now properly introduce Professor Stephen Ashheim. He's emeritus professor at history at the Hebrew University, Jerusalem, where he taught cultural and intellectual history. He also served as director of the Franz Rosenzweig Research Center for German Literature and Cultural History. And there I had a chance to become acquainted with Stephen in the early years as a fellow of the Rosenzweig Center. I continue to greatly appreciate what an excellent teacher and friend and source of inspiration for all of us very early career fellows at that time. I think I was in my early 20s, participating in the seminars of the center. And I would also like, even so, I will do it in a mild form, Stephen, this time, point out to a central conflict, without naming names, that I think happened there at the center at this period. And I mention it because I think that this conflict has exactly to do with the Mosse legacy in the work of Stephen, and maybe you will correct me afterwards. Stephen's cultural historical approach to German Jewish history is in a certain way approach in depth to George Mosse's work, and methodology represents a clear counterpoint to what at that point was the approach representing at the center that I would describe as a way to look at Judaism in a more essentialist way. In any event, that period in Jerusalem represented a great opportunity for me to learn a great deal from Stephen, and an opportunity for which I continue to be highly thankful, to see that there are these cultural, historical approaches to German Jewish history, and there is a very essentialist approach to it, and there were big clashes between those positions. And I don't know if they still exist, but at that time they were extremely relevant. Apart from academic journals, Stephen has published in also widely in the Times Literary Supplement, in the New York Times, in Jewish Review of Books. He spent time not just in Jerusalem, but in Berkeley, in Princeton. He was the first Mosse exchange professor at the University of Madison. And in 2002-03, he spent time as a researcher at Columbia. He taught at the University of Maryland, Reed College, and at the Freie Universität here in Berlin, at the Central European University in Budapest. He was a fellow at the Hamburg Institute for Social Research, and he was also the Stan Gold Visiting Professor of Jewish History at Trinity College in Dublin. He was a fellow of the Strauss Institute for the Advanced Study of Law and Justice at the New York University School of Law. And we met again in 2016, where he was a fellow at the Dubnow Institute. In 2017, Stephen held the first Menasse Ben Israel Institute Chair in Jewish Studies and at the University of Amsterdam, and also taught in Antwerp. His main books, Brothers and Strangers, The East European Jew in German and German Jewish Consciousness, 1800 to 1923, The Nietzsche Legacy in Germany, 1819 to 1919, Culture and Catastrophe, German and Jewish Confrontations with National Socialism and Other Crises. Then, In Times of Crisis, Essays on European Cultural Germans and Jews, Madison 2001. Then his book on Scholem, Arendt, Klemperer, Intimate Chronicle in Turbulent Times, 2001. Beyond the Border, The German-Jewish Legacy Abroad, Princeton University Press, 2007. And now, finally, the last book I will mention, his new collection, Fragile Spaces, Forays into Jewish Memory, European History and Complex Identities, that appeared 2018. Steven, the floor is yours. I'm very glad you're here.